Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This is the In Too Deep podcast. And today I'm very excited for the opportunity to pick the brain of neuroscientist Dr. Sarah McKay. Now, Sarah has had over 30 years experience in the neuroscience space. She's an Oxford graduate and even has a couple of books underneath her belt. So super excited to have her on. And I've got to say, thanks so much for coming on today, Sarah. And it's an absolute pleasure to meet you.
Thanks for having me.
I'd love to kick off our show by essentially asking straight from the horse's mouth, who is Dr. Sarah McKay?
Oh gosh, I don't know whether I'm very deep when it comes to these kinds of things. I suppose personally, I'm a mum to two teenage boys, a wife. I have a very cool and awesome husband. I grew up in New Zealand, but have spent more of my life in Australia. So I'm not sure whether I necessarily consider myself a Kiwi or an Aussie. Definitely call myself a neuroscientist and science communicator, if I had to give myself those kinds of labels. And I also think I'm a pretty good friend.
Okay.
I have very long, enduring friendships. I'm a very loyal person too.
Yeah. Love to hear that. And so from what I gather, you're trying to make a very complex subject like neuroscience easily digestible for the everyday person, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So tell us, how did you end up where you are? 30 years in this field. So how did you get to where you are today?
Gosh, well, you can really only, I think it was Steve Jobs said, connect the dots, looking back. So neuroscience, from when I first kind of met it as a discipline, was just captivating and fascinating. And I think that you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can look at, zoom in and look at the brain and look at neurons and synapses and molecules and neurotransmitters and find something interesting and meaningful and useful within that about how humans think, feel, and behave. And then you can almost zoom out and look like across a whole globe and look at trends around brain health and well-being and make meaning out of that too. And I think as a discipline, it's just endlessly fascinating because of that ability to sort of zoom in and zoom out, and kind of make meaning of the science and the research. I have two undergraduate degrees and one PhD in neuroscience. I worked for many years doing neuroscience medical research and research institutes, and then got a little bit frustrated. I really liked bench research and doing the technical, bench work of medical research, but got quite frustrated with the fact you have to become an expert in a very narrow field of neuroscience. And I kind of felt like I was missing out on thinking and talking about all of the other things. So that was sort of 16, 17 years ago now, made the jump away from the kind of bench research more into translational work and working in sort of science communication, talking about the science to other people. And I suppose over the years, like lots of people's businesses do, it's sort of changed shape slightly. I now do a lot of podcasts like this. I write books, I speak, I teach online professional development programs in neuroscience. But really the fascination about the brain has been, the foundation that whole way through. It's never really wavered. And every single day I will read a paper or learn something new that some researcher has done where I get that same wow, that is so cool feeling I got when I was an undergraduate, back in the 90s.
Yeah. So 30 years later, you're still getting lit up in this way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So
100%.
after 30 years in the field, what's the most important thing you've learned about our brain so far?
The most important thing, gosh, I'm sure there's one thing. I think I've spent a lot of time in the last 10 years in the women's brain health space. And I think the one thing I would say about that is that the female brain isn't broken. I feel like the stories that we tell ourselves and the people around us from puberty, you've got puberty blues, and you've got anxiety and depression, and pregnancy and baby brain, and then you hit midlife and you've got menopause and brain fog and dementia and Alzheimer's disease. The story seems to be this continuation of dysfunction and emotional instability and decline. and things going wrong. And I don't think brains are broken. I find that conversation incredibly frustrating. So one, I don't think brains are broken. And two, the work that I've done, both the research that I've done and the translating other people's research, is that I think that the greatest influence, the greatest way to build resilience, the greatest strength, and perhaps also the source of vulnerability when it's not there is other people, as social support networks and relationships. I think that's what brains fundamentally need and the strongest predictor, or in their absence, risk factor for brain health and well-being and healthy aging.
Okay, so tell us more about that. You're saying something like loneliness can be extremely detrimental, and you're saying connection is of extreme importance. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I think vast amounts of our brain processing is taken up by processing social cognition, social cues from other people, what other people are thinking and feeling and saying, biological movement, making meaning of that, deploying the kinds of appropriate behaviors in response to other people. Lots of our brain processing is taken up with that. So we kind of know from a what does the brain do perspective that's a large amount of kind of cognitive capacity is taken up with that. If we look kind of in a more public health, population health perspective, we've got really good data that shows whether someone is lonely and or socially isolated. Those are two slightly different things. The risks for everything from poor mental health through to increased mortality rise significantly, and being surrounded by other people is the best predictor of kind of a long, healthy health span and lifespan. Loneliness and social isolation is slightly different in that loneliness is the emotional perception of being alone or unsupported. So you could be surrounded by people,
Yeah, you could
but
have
feel
a
lonely.
platonic family, but still feel lonely because you're disconnected with people around you.
You feel you have an emotion which you would call loneliness, which can then make yourself isolate yourself from people more and can make you feel more lonely. So it can be a bit sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. Social isolation is different in that often that someone can be lonely. Someone could be perhaps enjoying solitude because they could be alone. But by social isolation, what we often see is there's that emotional loneliness aspect of it. But then there's just the pragmatic day-to-day business of if someone's elderly and they are socially isolated, no one can help them. They might need help with groceries. They might need help with just the activities of daily life. They might need someone to take them to the doctor. They might need someone to pick up the medication from the pharmacy. So there's the kind of the pragmatic day-to-days, which also are contributors to poor health. So we see it across the lifespan, from newborn babies to the elderly, that risk factor, or protective factor, the other way around is other people.
Okay, that's interesting. So you would say maybe the number one factor to someone's mental health would be to not isolate themselves and make sure they're getting human connection interaction. Is that correct?
Yes, although that's sometimes easier said than done, because you could be a teenager in high school who is going through, your social brain networks are reorganizing and rewiring as you go through adolescence. That's sort of part of the natural process of puberty in a brain. And you could fundamentally desire the different kinds of social connections than what you're getting. You could be surrounded by kids in the classroom all day, but you might feel left out. So you wouldn't just say to a teenager, you're not lonely, you're surrounded by people. It's more complicated than that. Okay. Sometimes it's like that perception of belonging that is important, and having relationships that you can rely on and people that you can call on. And we've got different kind of relationships with different types of people through our lives, in which we could kind of bump off or not.
So what would you say, and obviously it's very vast and complex, you just use the example of a teenager, but what's the solution?
I don't think there's a solution, to being lonely. Well, I that's a hard one. I'm not sure whether neuroscience has answers to that. I suppose that's a bit more of a fundamental question. What's an answer to loneliness? I know that there is some, I personally don't know the answer to that. I know that there is some research that's been done by some social cognitive neuroscientists up in Queensland. Alex Haslam and Catherine Haslam are a couple of scientists who work in the space, and they've done some work looking at how can we, in a very pragmatic way, create social networks and connections for people, depending on whether it's kids in school, or they've worked with like people newly released from prison, or they've looked at, young men entering the workforce who may be feeling like they're lonely or whatever. And they literally get them to work through the different sources of social connection within their lives. Like, let's look at family, let's look at work, let's look at hobbies. Let's not just say you should go and make more friends, but pragmatically, what might be some sources of relationship and connection could you find? What would be the actions to put in place to kind of expose yourself to more people where you could make more connections and relationships? How are you going to go about that in a very pragmatic sense? So, there are kind of tried and tested solutions, but that's not necessarily the kind of advice that you're just going to give to someone who feels lonely. I think it's just important for us to realise that is one of the predictors. It's not the only predictor. Whenever I talk about brain health, I always talk about, what's happening in your body from the bottom up, what's happening in the outside world, social connections, community, and the environment we live in. And that's everything from, the rising and setting of the sun to our built environment, to our communities. And then there's also that top down. So if I was to rank the many hundreds of things which are important for brain health, social would come right up the very, very top. And that's because that's what the data shows.
Yeah. And what's sort of, I guess, the next couple after social?
I'm not sure. Well, I suppose it depends whether we're looking at things like dementia risk, or whether we're looking at peak performance, or whether we're looking at mental health.
Let's talk peak performance, and that's what a lot of
peak
listeners
performance.
are after.
Yeah, that's what the bros always like.
The bros.
So I think sleep is probably the next if I had to pick one. I usually say social and then sleep, because if you haven't got a foundation of sleep, you can't really kind of build anything else on that. You can't build a healthy diet. It's hard to have a good exercise regime. It's hard to make, reduce, be thoughtful and careful about your emotional regulation and reduce your stress, etc. So I think having sleep sorted, which again will vary depending on who you are and where you are in your life.
I was going to say, what is the sort of recommendations for different age groups and populations when it comes to sleep?
I'm not necessarily an expert on the recommendations. I have written about it in one of my books. I'd have to go and look it up. I think we're kind of moving away from the idea that you need a certain number of hours of sleep a night. And when you are 16, this is what you need. When you're 66, this is what you need. What we understand, sleep will vary, but at some times in life it's hard to get. You can't tell a new mum, who's in her 20s, well, the ideal amount of sleep for someone of your age is 8.5. Sucks to be you with a newborn.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that. That's actually what new mothers need, is to call in the cavalry, and new mothers need to be mothered and need more support than almost anyone, I think. I think what we're starting to understand now is what people need is, somewhere between 6 to 8 hours a night, roughly speaking, but it's about regularity of bedtimes and regularity of wake times. It's about getting good quality, deep sleep and having a nice kind of neat sleep architecture, which are the different levels of sleep that you would kind of track through over the course of a night. And kind of habitual, regular sleep and wake times are what are slightly more predictive than actual simply total sleep time we see. And that's going to vary. Obviously, small children and teenagers need more sleep because their brains are growing and developing. And when brains are growing and developing and learning a lot, they need more sleep because they need to consolidate what they've learned during the day, and that's what sleep's for. As you get older, people tend to not be learning as much and doing as much. So, there's kind of a bit of a feedback loop there. They often feel like they require less sleep and perhaps wake more at night and spend, less time asleep, in sound sleep. So it's very hard to kind of be super prescriptive.
Yeah.
I think is my long-winded way of saying it.
And so as we age, we tend to need less sleep because our brains and our bodies are less active. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, but if you are keeping yourself physically and cognitively stimulated and active during the day, then you've kind of got more processing that needs to be done by the brain when it is asleep at night. So ideally you were still getting a decent amount of sleep, but typically what we see is that people, particularly elderly people, do spend more time kind of awake overnight than like little kids.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And so your female specific brain health, like I saw your books, and I've listened to a few podcasts. So tell me, is there much of a difference between the male and the female brain? Because I was quite
Yeah.
surprised to see that there wasn't as much as a difference as I would have expected.
There's a couple of ways we can kind of look at this. I think people think male and female brains are going to be like, open up a boy's head and there's a blue brain inside and it's completely different in every way from a girl's head. We're going to open it up and see a pink brain on the inside. I sometimes say a brain is a bit like a whole body. There are lots of similarities and there's some very clear differences. So, we've both got hands and feet and heads and eyes and, digestive tracts and hair growing out of our head. Well, you've got less than me, but,
None at all.
we've got fingernails, there's bones, there's so many similarities, but there are some very clear differences. I've got female specific sexual organs, you would have male specific sexual organs, you've got secondary sexual characteristics, you've got a beard, I've got breasts. So we've got some things which are very, very similar, but some things which are very, very distinct. And we see that if we look at a whole brain, if we were to compare a male brain and a female brain, there will be many functions and many features of the brain which will be almost exactly the same between all of humans, and then there will be some components or features or functions of brains which will be more likely to be seen in a male brain and more likely to be seen in a female brain. The thing is, we've always got to compare not just one brain with another brain. We're going to look at 1,000 men and 1,000 women, and typically what we're going to see is if we do see sex differences in certain features, often there's a lot of overlap. It's not, we've kind of got these standard distribution curves which overlap, a little bit like height. So height is, on average, a group of 1,000 men are going to be taller than a group of 1,000 women, but I'm quite tall, right? I'm nearly 5'10", my sister's 6 foot, so we're tall, but we're definitely clearly female. And we can quite easily kind of hold that idea. Brains are not that dissimilar in that we'll have some features which are more male-like, some are more female-like, but there'll be a lot of overlap. When we do see clear sex differences, perhaps in like a certain type of cognitive test, or maybe a certain part of the brain, the volume of a certain part of the brain, or maybe, receptor subunit components in a certain part of the brain, the question is then, do those differences arrive purely based on biology? Is it due to genes? Is it due to sex hormones? Was it patterned in utero by sex hormones? Did it come about via pubertal sex hormones? Or did those differences emerge based on the gendered experiences that we might have that would differ between being a male and being a female? So there's an example I often like to give whereby a study was done that looked at different countries in the world, a bunch of brain scans looking at people in their 30s, and there's certain parts of the brain where we might see small volume differences between certain structures in the brain, and we could kind of, like machine learning could perhaps judge whether that brain was male or female with about 80% accuracy, say. But what they did in this study, they had all of these different countries, all of these different brain scans, and then they ranked the countries in the world in this study based on gender equality. So in countries where there was greater gender equality, so like the Nordic countries and here in Australia, the male and the female brains were much more similar. And in countries where there was greater gender inequality, in this study they were Turkey and Brazil and India, the brains were more different. And so that's saying we've got a combination here of biological sex, but what's also contributing to the difference was the biography or the experiences of those people as they grow up.
Yeah.
And mostly in these studies where there were differences, it was the female brains that were different from the male. The males were the same everywhere in the world, with the female brains where there was greater gender inequality. And so that comes about because perhaps those girls had less access to education, less access to enriched workplace, employment opportunities, and perhaps this sort of the stress of growing up with less access to opportunity. So it's a very, very complex, way. I've been very verbose and long-winded here. There are some parts of the brain show sex differences. Many parts of the brain show none. When we do see them, sometimes it's driven by biology, by genes and or hormones, and sometimes it's driven by sociology, by the experiences you've had throughout life.
Okay, that's fascinating. So that's crazy. So you're saying countries with gender inequality that's when you can really tell the difference between these brains.
There's more difference between those brains. Yeah, and they've even done studies there's an interesting study done in the US recently looking at dementia risk. So it was looking at people who are kind of in their 80s and 90s and looking at cognitive decline and dementia risk. And what they found was that they looked at each state in the US. So, and this was kind of casting back in time to what the lives of people in their 80s and 90s was in their youth. And the more equality there was in that particular state. So in this study, I believe the state of Connecticut had the greatest gender equality. And then I think it was Mississippi, it was one of the southern states, had the greatest gender inequality. And the gender gap kind of shrunk or grew depending on what the lives were like when those people were younger, such that female brains were more at risk of cognitive decline and dementia when they had less access to opportunity compared to the males. So and then a similar kind of, they saw something else similar play out, particularly in this US study when they were looking at race. So they were looking at African American versus non-white Americans. And again, you could see that kind of structural inequality influenced how the brain's aged. So, biological sex is just one aspect that influences how a brain is shaped and sculpted. The experiences we have matter too.
That's very fascinating. And it's funny because, generally the general consensus is, women are more emotional, they're more emotional brains, guys.
Yeah, there's actually been some very interesting studies on this idea of women being more emotional. And I always think that what we should be thinking about is what happens when we're driving down a road and someone's in a ute behind you and starts tooting at you because you took like 3 milliseconds longer than they wanted for you to pull away when the light turned green. I guarantee it'll be an emotional dude. So we've all got the lived experiences of men being quite emotional and women being reasonably together. We just need to kind of look globally at what kind of plays out in terms of violence and wars and overly emotional reactions to things happening. Men can be incredibly emotional, so we hear these stories, but I don't necessarily think it plays out. In the public sphere, we can also take a look at what happens, let's take a look at how much emotion varies across the course of the day or perhaps over the month when we're looking at girls and women. Really interesting study. I wrote about it in my my updated version of the Women's Brain book by a neuroscience researcher, Adrienne Beltz. And she got a bunch of guys, a bunch of girls. Half the girls were on the oral contraceptive pill, half weren't. They were naturally cycling. And then she got everyone every single day. They would draw blood so they could see exactly what people's hormone levels were. And they got everyone at 3 different points across the day. Like a little app popped up in their phone and it said, what's your emotional state right now? And there would be like 10 positive emotional states to draw from, 10 neutral and 10 negative. They had to say what the emotional state was, whether it was anger or irritability or joy or contentment or boredom. And then they had to rate that, how, strong were they feeling that emotion, or how, from 1 to 5, like the depth of the emotion or the extreme of the emotion. And what she found was that actually males' emotions varied more across the course of the day and actually showed greater variation than females. So, we've seen it playing out in the political stage, in the global stage. She also saw it play out in the research stage in the lab there. And when they were looking at how hormone levels fluctuated and varied, they found that men's testosterone actually varies much more across the course of a day than women's hormones do, even across the course of the month. So there was not that same tight correlation between female hormones and emotions, male hormones and emotions. Rather, the men varied far more than actually the women did in emotionality. So, like, all of these gender stereotypes that are wafting their way around are typically doing women a disservice and upping men, and I think that we need to flip that little script.
Well, that's hilarious. And when you mention things like who are the ones starting all the wars and doing all the crazy shit around the
Well,
world,
everyone knows that. No one just wants to say it out loud.
oh, well, there we go. We've got it on record here.
Mm.
I see you mentioned visualization quite a lot.
Yes.
So I hear about these studies, and I don't know how accurate they are. They're sort of things I've heard in passing over the years. These studies of people pretend like shooting a free throw, basketball free throw, whereas the person visualizing themselves shooting the free throw will improve their free throws just as good as someone actually out there practicing a free throw. Are you aware of any of these studies?
Yeah.
And can you tell me a little bit more about
Yeah.
what we can use visualization for as a tool for peak performance and success?
Yeah, there is quite a lot of research in this space, and we've seen from everything from improving performance, like you said, throwing a free throw to
Like playing
a lot
piano,
of yeah,
that sort of
playing
stuff.
piano. A lot of work's also been done looking at using in surgery, looking at surgeons like learning particular techniques and things because you don't want a brain surgeon to be just practicing on brains. You want them to be when they're in your brain doing the surgery to be very precise and to be able to kind of accurately perform the procedures that they need to. And I would say, but like if I had to make a broad statement, visualization alone does improve performance and does improve outcomes, but it doesn't improve it in every case all of the time more than performing the actual task.
Okay.
And it's very task dependent, context dependent, and probably depends on how well you are doing the visualization. Typically what you would do is both, and you would use the visualization as kind of an add-on to improve. So a gymnast, for example, and you can often see athletes like at the Olympics, or perhaps, you're watching someone kicking a conversion in rugby or whatever, you can often see them visualize. You can like literally see by the look on their face that they're visualizing that motor skill in advance of actually performing it. They've not only visualized it, they have physically practiced that multiple times. So it's the combination of the two. The visualization is just a nice little add-on. There is some recent research that came out looking at, and it's particularly perhaps useful for rehab, looking to see if you simply visualize lifting weights, you can actually see a tiny increase in muscle strength. Now, you're certainly not going to see the same increase in muscle strength simply by imagining going to the gym than you would as if you actually went to the gym and actually lifted weights. But it may be that it might be quite a useful way to think about rehab or prehab. So someone's recovering from surgery, perhaps they're elderly, perhaps they're frail. We need to kind of get them up and out of bed, and we can kind of get them practicing that kind of maneuver in their mind a number of times. So then they've kind of practiced it before they do the real thing, so it doesn't feel like they're doing it for the very first time. So there's a few different ways in there. If we were to scan someone's brain when they were performing an actual task versus simply imagining performing the task, we often see the same networks in the brain become activated. And, a pianist, for example, could practice a piece on the piano in their mind's eye. They're going on a long plane trip to present to do a concert. They could pretend in their mind's eye in the plane, but that's not going to be as good as doing it for real. But if we were to image their brain, we would see similar networks become activated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
But you need to do both, though.
Oh yeah, of course. You can't just sit on your ass and just like hope for the best, right? You need to have both. And so, how would you use this specifically in your courses to teach people about visualization?
Yeah, I think. Well, people, I suppose, understand the concept of performance, and particularly athletic performance and learning motor skills. It's also really useful to think about what I talk about when I in my courses is specifically around the concept of emotional regulation. And you can imagine practicing a talk in advance, so you know the words that you're going to say. But we can also use it to practice our emotional regulation skills in advance, because emotions are really no different to any other kind of construction within our brain, like a thought or an imaginary process. Emotions are constructed on demand based on the feelings we have in our body, the context we're in, and the words we use to describe them. And so you can rehearse an emotion in advance as well. Say you've got a presentation coming up and you're really, really nervous. You can practice not just the presentation, but you can practice how you will feel and react and respond emotionally, before you walk in the room while you're giving that performance or presentation, and then afterwards. You can rehearse your emotions in the same way as rehearsing the actual talk itself. You're not like riding a roller coaster of emotions that you can't control. You can imagine them in advance, practice them in advance, and then they will roll out on demand too.
Okay, well, I'm very fascinated about this. I hate public speaking, first of all. Like being in front of people for some reason really bothers me. So like you're saying if I visualize myself getting nervous and actually feeling nervous prior and then figuring out how I would react, that would be the best way to
Yeah,
go
well,
about the
visualize
situation?
yourself not feeling nervous. Visualize yourself, this kind of excitement and positive anticipation and, what's the feeling going to be in your body? What are you going to be seeing around you? And this, and you have to engage all of your senses. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are you feeling? And then perhaps if you know you've got a tendency to get overly nervous, don't practice getting nervous in your imagination and in your rehearsal. Go, oh, well, when I start feeling nervous, this is what I will do to counteract that. I know that this particular breathing technique works, or, drinking a cold glass of water or jumping up and down, or, you've got your kind of toolbox and your strategies, and then practice the emotion that you do want to feel.
Okay.
And then, it's what happens in theatre, right? An actor gets up on stage, a performer. Acting is simply you've practiced this emotion that you're going to feel, and you get up, and an actor will cry on demand because they've practiced and rehearsed that, and they're getting up, and it's a real emotion they're feeling in their body that they're performing, that they've practiced and rehearsed.
Yeah.
And so there's no difference between what they're doing and what anyone else would be doing if you're, turning up and standing up in front of people.
Yeah,
and doing
right.
it.
And so do you have a recommendation for what this practice would look like, how often you should do it, how long you should spend in that sort of state?
I'm not really into kind of those prescriptive protocols as much, rather, I don't know. I mean, it's really like, I suppose if you're giving a talk, however many times you practice the talk, part of that rehearsal should involve practicing how you feel
Okay.
too. So I don't know, every few times a day, every day for the week in advance.
Okay.
I don't really have a protocol.
That's all right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So you mentioned emotional regulation, which
Yeah.
is a huge one because like our emotions dictate how we behave in every day-to-day interaction, whether you're a parent, whether you're at work, whether you're with a spouse. What are the tools, apart from visualization, can you recommend people implement so they can have better emotional regulation?
Yeah, I think understanding what emotions are and where they come from, like I think awareness is really that first step. I think people think we're kind of born with this repository of hardwired emotions in some part of our brain, and they roll out kind of against our will or, automatically in response to a situation, and we've just got to kind of cope with them and maybe fight with them or let them control us. But we've learned, emotions are no different to any other learned experience or any other thought we have, and that they're constructed in our brains based on the physiological state within our body, the context in which we're in, and then the perception or kind of almost how we are making meaning of that physiological state within the context we're in. So if we understand how our brain makes emotions, then we can understand how we can change some of perhaps the data that the brain is using to make an emotion, or the ingredients the brain is kind of mixing to create an emotion. So say you have an undesired, and I know what it's like when you've got really small children and they're losing their shit and they're tired and they're hungry. When the water's low, the rocks will show. When it comes to kids, typically what they need is food, water, and rest, and a bit of TLC. We need to model, appropriate emotional responses to them. So then we need to understand what is happening in our body, in our brain, and in the context, and that's perhaps causing us to feel an emotion that we don't want to feel. Or so it'll be, when you're kind of feeling that kind of irritation and the rage sort of starting to bubble up when you're trying to control your children, what is happening in your body? Like, just kind of take some time to be aware of literally what are the feelings in your body. Perhaps are you thirsty or hungry or tired? You're irritable. It's harder to manage an emotion when physiologically you're not stable and physiologically you're not in homeostasis. Like, that's a massive kind of component of a negative emotion, or perhaps a kind of an emotion that involves your nervous system kind of being very heightened and intense. And then perhaps what is the context you're in? Can you do something as simple as, and I mean, it's all, everyone just wants to talk about taking some big deep breaths as if breath is the only tool we've got. Breath is a really useful tool that we have, but we could also perhaps walk outside for 2 or 3 minutes, like change the context of the situation we're in. It might not be safe to leave little kids somewhere, but it also could be quite safe to put a crying child in a cot and walk out of the room and have a cold drink of water yourself, like literally change the context that you and your body is in. And you've got some different kind of data coming in, and that might kind of be a way to calm down. And then we've also got the words we use. The another ingredient of emotions is really this kind of emotional literacy that we have, and some people have a very small, limited range of vocab to describe the emotions they have. I was talking to my stepdad about this a few years ago, and he said he kind of had 2 emotions, okay and a bit shit. And they were his 2 emotions.
That I've mentioned on this podcast before. The first time I saw a psychologist in my early 20s, she asked me to list the emotions I could feel, and it was like happy and sad.
Happy and sad, yeah. And so she would have taught you, I'm sure, like expanding your emotional literacy by learning to. You can even just like go and read lists of words that describe emotional states. People, the word Schadenfreude from German, which means a bit of smug joy at someone else's misfortune, is not an English word, but once it's made its way into English, then people suddenly had access. It was almost like, now I understand what that emotion is because I have a word to describe it. So if we expand our emotional literacy, we've got access to more words, then we've also got new ingredients that we're putting into the mix of an emotion. So awareness of all of this and an awareness that we could change perhaps the words we're using to describe it, where we're turning our attention, what is happening in our physiological state, can we move our body and our brain somewhere else into a different context? All of these will build our understanding of emotions and lead us towards, it gives us kind of a broader landscape in which we can choose to act next instead of being very narrow and reactive.
Okay, give me an example of that. So you're saying just the awareness of a certain type of emotion, instead of going, I'm just either angry or happy.
Yeah.
Say I'm annoyed or I'm a little sleepy.
And there's lots of tools out there, especially for people who think that expanding their emotional literacy would be great. There's a really great app called How I Feel, or How We Feel app, which is, and I'm always a massive proponent of it, and my stepdad is now as well, where it kind of walks you through screen by screen. Perhaps are you feeling high energy good, high energy bad, low energy good, low energy bad? And then what if you choose high energy bad? It will take you through, there might be like 20 different kinds of words, from angry to irritated to frustrated to, disappointed would probably be low energy. And then, it kind of breaks each word down into more and more and more components. And then you've got the opportunity then, if you're feeling irritated, to describe the situation you're in, what led you to this point. Do you want to stay here? Do you want to move into a different emotional state? Here are some options of how you might be able to move into that emotional state. That's just like a really great app that teaches emotional literacy. There's also an emotion wheel, and some Google, if anyone's listening or watching, just like Google emotion wheel, and it will have like, it's got these little like kind of pies,
with different colors,
and it will have like anger, and then it will have anger broken up into like 5 different options, and then those 5 options into 3 or 4 each. So instead of just feeling angry, maybe you've got 20 different words to describe your specific state, and then that means you've got 20 different options of how to act next. That said, I do think we shouldn't be only focusing in on our emotions as if every decision next should be made based on an emotional state. I think sometimes it's a little bit like, I heard this great analogy that it's a little bit like standing on like kind of a wheelie office chair to reach, something off a high shelf. We shouldn't be solely relying on our emotions and only focusing in on our emotions as if they are the only kind of component of us which matters and which should be used as a guide. I think we've also kind of got to use more of that kind of logic, rational thinking brain. If we marinate in our emotions only, I don't necessarily think I think we can almost place more emphasis on them than is necessarily wise. I think it's just the awareness of how we are constructing them and what we are doing with them, and how we can perhaps shift from one emotional state to another if the state we're in is not desirable. That is kind of what emotional regulation and emotional literacy is about.
So obviously it's not wise just to act on every emotion we feel, right? It's more important to
No.
be aware of the emotion, label it.
Yeah.
And look, emotions pass, right? So being aware of it and
100%,
letting it go
yeah.
until you're in a more calm and regulated state of mind.
100%. Toddlers react and respond and let emotions
And
guide
some
them.
adults as well.
And we would hope that as we mature and then become a teenager and then we go through adolescent brain development, we get better at that kind of emotional regulation and our literacy expands and we get better control. But some people don't.
Yeah, we all certainly have our moments, don't we?
Yeah, yeah.
I want you to tell me what you're most excited for in the neuroscience space.
I think what's happening right now, which is really exciting, is it's a bit like what we've been telling kids in schools to do, is collaborate and cooperate. So for many, many years, many research labs were very siloed. You know, you had a group of researchers in Sydney and a group of researchers in London and another in the US and some in China and some in France, and everyone was kind of almost working on the same project, but we're almost in, competition with each other. And now I think we've realised that there's, a lot of power in numbers, and the more data we have and the more kind of pooling together and cooperation and data sharing that we've got, the quicker we can find solutions and the quicker we can kind of solve a few problems out there. So there is a massive move right now towards big data and towards consortiums and open access sharing of everything from, brain scans to biobanks, which, maybe enrolling large numbers of people in and gathering lots and lots of information about every aspect of their biology and psychology and lives, and putting all of that data together in big open access kind of banks that researchers all around the world can add to and also mine. And alongside this kind of big data and this data sharing, we've got machine learning and we've got AI, which means we don't need to, struggle to analyze the data on a big Excel spreadsheet. We've got far more sophisticated ways of analyzing that. And I think what we're seeing, instead of, in the past, you might do a brain imaging study and there might be 20 people in the study and it wasn't showing, anything in particular. We were getting strange results and labs were showing very conflicting data when they were doing the same protocol. Now we might have 20,000 or 100,000 brain scans. And we're able to see the signal noise ratio is completely different. We're able to say things with much more certainty when we've got more data and we've got more numbers. And that's really just come about from a real sort of shift in the culture of how science is being done. And I think, with technology kind of enabling that, digital, data sharing and enabling that. So I think that some really cool and interesting, ideas are starting to emerge from that, both, looking, throughout the lifespan, really, like kind of every aspect of neuroscience is starting to shift based on big data, which sounds very nerdy, but it's throwing up some super interesting
Yeah, look, it makes sense. You're saying that globally we're becoming much more connected and collaborative in the way we attack neuroscience. So you'd think that, the progress we see is going to be much more rapid.
100%, yeah, is much more rapid. There's still some things which are going to take time. The kind of the gold standard, or what I would like to see, is more large longitudinal studies, which again sounds very nerdy and boring, but that simply means, maybe we've got like 1,000 kids who are born in a particular country, in a certain year, and if we can like study every aspect of their lives and then follow them their whole way through their lives, we can just learn so much, because we're not relying on people self-reporting about their diet or where they went to school or, something about their parents. We're studying them really closely and there's no gaps for the data to fall into. But then we've still got to wait for those kids to grow up. Say it's easy to look at across, because of course my interest is within girls and women's brain health, to study what happens to a brain across a pregnancy, because it's only 9 months, but to study how pregnancy and motherhood influence dementia risk later in life, we've got to wait 30 or 40 or 50 years. We can't speed up time, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's half a lifetime.
We've got to just sometimes be really patient. But I think what's happening right now is that there's been a massive recognition as well. That there's lots of gaps in the research, and there's lots of really amazing scientists who are sort of working really hard to plug those gaps. Sometimes we just need to be a bit patient because we can't. Unfortunately, we can get more data. We can't speed up time yet.
Yeah, just gonna have to wait half a lifetime or something like
Yeah.
that. Okay, so tell me, you had a bit of a controversial opinion when it came to meditation when I asked you off camera, right? I'm a meditator. I find I personally get a lot out of it. The mindfulness thing, I had a lot of anxiety in my early 20s, and being introduced to that helped me a lot. But from what you're saying, it's, being pushed too much as like a, be all and end all panacea to everyone's anxiety and stress.
Yeah, I think if you're anxious and you have anxiety, what kind of intervention or treatment or tool works for some people some of the time will not work for everyone all of the time. And we all kind of know that, right? It's a little bit like exercise. There's lots of different ways you can improve your cardiovascular fitness. There's just not one way. It's not only CrossFit. It's not only running up and down your drive and doing it at a high intensity interval training. It's not only swimming down in Manly. It's not only surfing. It's not only walking your dog, right? There's 100 ways in which you can kind of end up with that same result. And I think that dealing with anxiety has, there's lots of tools that we should have in our toolkit. And mindfulness/meditation practices are really useful for lots of people. I think what we're starting to see, particularly when it comes to universal mental health interventions or universal mindfulness meditation trainings, and I'm mostly familiar with this being rolled out within schools, certainly when we've tested whether it works in schools, and there's research that was published a couple of years ago in the British Medical Journal, neuroscientist named Sarah Jane Blakemore has done a lot of research in this space. For example, they were like, well, if we simply go in and teach a mindfulness-based stress reduction program and roll it out across high school students in the UK, we'll get rid of anxiety and depression. And so they went in and they tested this universal intervention, and they found it actually made a subset of kids much worse. So first, do no harm, right? It helped some kids. The majority of the kids could not care less, thought it was boring, didn't want to practice, weren't interested. And so now what we're starting to see is a little bit of a roll back, at least within academia and at least within the research space. The conversations are, we need to start rolling back these universal mental health interventions. This universal only ever talking about social emotional well-being in primary schools, universal mental health interventions, and go back to the older style targeted approach. We know what works. Kids, if you're feeling unhappy, here's the person that you can reach out to for help. Because what we're seeing is when kids are approaching and asking for help, and then the facilities and the resources and the tools or the people are there to react and respond when they need that, then that's a far more useful intervention than telling everyone in the whole classroom to practice mindfulness. For anxiety interventions, for example. So the data on that's quite clear. It's just not quite a popular idea yet, because of course lots of people build businesses around this kind of thing. But yeah, there's a few different researchers. People will look up the work of Lucy Foulkes, Foulkes, and also Sarah Jane Blakemore, who they do a lot of research in this kind of adolescent mental health space. So it works for some people some of the time. If it works for you, go for it. If it doesn't work for you, don't feel bad about it. Don't feel shamed. Don't feel guilty that it doesn't work for you. There's 100 different ways to climb that mountain.
It's funny. And so you're saying from a public health perspective, try to keep it as individualized as possible, as opposed to going, here's a one size fits all approach for the entire,
Exactly.
school. Wait till, someone's triggered in a certain way and then specialize it according to
100%. So long as the kids know what is there on offer for them, and then there is good help available when they reach out, it needs to go back to that more individualized approach. Certainly that's the current state of the research in that space.
So what are your thoughts on my 5-year-old daughter who's in kindy being exposed to this anti-anxiety program that the state government's currently running?
Look, I think I don't know enough about that particular program to really comment. I think we like things kind of trends come and go, and there's always swings and roundabouts. And I do think certainly within the youth mental health space, we are sometimes also creating the same problems that we're trying to solve unless we've got good tried and tested interventions. I mean, it may be that this particular intervention has been tried and tested and it has been shown to improve outcomes. I couldn't really necessarily comment on a specific program, rather talk about the research that I'm familiar with.
Okay, that's fair. Can we use neuroscience to build greater resilience?
I don't know whether we can use neuroscience, but we can perhaps think about what neuroscience research shows in terms of what builds resilience in people. I know there's a little bit of talk, not necessarily in neuroscience, maybe in psychology, is resilience a state? Is it a trait? Is it a
Genetics,
process? And again, lots of these things come down to how you define them and how you once you've defined exactly what you mean, then you can operationalize it. I suppose if we're talking about what would build resilience in young people, to build them up so they're less vulnerable or more resilient to developing mental health problems, there's going to be so many different tools in the toolbox. There's what's happening, as I said, in someone's physiological body. Are they physiologically, cardiovascularly and metabolically resilient so that their brain and their body is well nourished and well slept and exercised and like almost like physically capable of getting through the day? What sort of social structures and support networks does a person have around them? Are they working in a workplace where they're verging on burnout because there's that real kind of lack of agency and autonomy? They feel like they've got no choices. They can't kind of dial in or dial out the work that they're doing to help them manage their own stress response. There's those kind of components, and then of course there's that kind of top down, that kind of psychological mindset component. Are you prone to rumination and anxiety and depression? Are you more upbeat? What's your personality style? What's your kind of learned approach to managing threatening situations? There's a lot of kind of ways in when it comes to a brain. There's nothing that's kind of more special than another.
Yeah, okay. That's funny. So it's more than just looking in the mirror and quoting mantras on how you want to be tougher type thing.
Yeah, I mean, you can do that. Might work for some people. Like there's I was speaking on a Stoics podcast a couple of days ago, and like the guy who was interviewing me had clearly found so much use from studying Stoicism and understanding Stoicism and taking on board that kind of Stoic approach to life and mindset. And that's great. But, I can't imagine my mum going and reading about Stoicism and finding that a useful approach. Her approach would be to kind of gather people around her to kind of, nurture her and support her. So everyone's got to have a different take on that. And the brain is literally taking on board information from all of these different sources. And there's lots of kind of underpinning biology and life experience that's determining how you're going to react and respond at any moment in time.
That makes sense. So tell me, apart from being, physically fit, working in nutrition, is there anything you could recommend, any daily rituals people can implement to make sure that their brain health is optimal?
Yeah, I think, there's the basics of the sleep and the regular wake times and sleep times and, the exercise and the nutrition. I think there's perhaps a couple of things. One would be, I find the world of well-being can be a bit joyless and a bit pious. There's not a lot of fun sometimes. People it's like they're like holding on with their fingernails. Like if they try really hard, they won't die. And we're all going to die, right? I feel like people are trying so hard to achieve peak wellness that they're forgetting to have fun along the way. And it's like, what's the point then? If you're not like, your joy span should also match your lifespan, should match your health span. You don't want to just live a long, healthy life if it's unfun. So I find that sometimes well-being can be taken very seriously, and it's not light. And I don't necessarily think that there's much. I just don't think that would be much. Who's that guy, Brian Johnson, who's trying to live forever? He just seems like he's having a really boring.
Yeah, he looks like a ghost.
He looks unhappy.
He doesn't look. He doesn't look
Like,
very well for someone.
Go for it, but I don't know. He doesn't look like he's having a good time along the way. He's not sucking the marrow out of life. So I think finding ways to have a laugh along the way, I think is important. And I'm also starting to think a lot more about attention, which is a very precious resource. It's a very precious brain resource. It's what information we take in and what we filter out, and how to be more thoughtful and deliberate about attention. Because certainly what I've noticed in the last year or two, and partly this is now I've got teenage sons who will like call me out all the time. We'll be talking and then they'll go, you already asked me that. And I'm like, I don't think that I've become forgetful, but I know what I have started doing a lot is I'm always listening to podcasts, and I've always kind of, I'm consuming a lot of content, whether that be through social media, whether that be through podcasts or audio books. And I feel like this constant presence of content and information is, I'm remembering all of that. So I know my mind and my brain are cognitively functioning normally, but it's shifting my attention away from actually really what's in front of me. And I was reading some interesting research recently about just simply having a phone present in the room. And this isn't all about like phone bans and social media bans for teenagers. I just think that it's becomes so salient and so relevant to us. It's almost like a newborn baby that's consuming so much of our attention. And new mums often talk about baby brain. They can't remember all of the things and their brain isn't functioning. That's because all of your attention is completely sucked and consumed by focusing on your baby. I'm almost starting to wonder if is a phone the same kind of thing. And there's some research that does all of these different types of cognitive testing on people. We can look at working memory or verbal recall or mental maths or reaction speed. You can do lots of different types of cognitive tests. And they've found that if someone even has a phone next to them, even if it's turned off and face down, their test scores will be much lower than if the phone is in another room. And it's almost as if your brain is being drained. It's not just that you're looking at the phone, it's almost the constant micro distraction of the phone and almost resisting the urge to think about your phone. It's almost as if our attention has kind of been sucked into this little glass box. And I'm worrying, or I'm wondering for myself whether my constant consumption of information, whether it's through my phone or not, but it's primarily through my phone, has sucked my attention away from kind of what's happening in the real world. So I'm trying at the moment, I'm sort of experimenting with, if I'm driving somewhere in the car, not to automatically put a podcast on. If I'm cooking or I'm walking the dog, to not automatically put a podcast on, but to try and be a little bit more present to see whether I can, then I'm using that time to process what's happened earlier in the day. And memory partly depends on kind of turning the ideas over in your mind, and whether that's going to mean I've got better memory for what I've been doing, because that's what I'm paying attention to, which is not necessarily mindfulness. Rather, it's trying to stop the shifts in attention or the multitasking that I think for me has come about by this constant consumption of information. Which is a great fun and interesting distraction, but I'm starting to notice that it's impacting real world relationships. Not that my kids don't like me, but I'll ask them something and they'll be like, you already asked me that. And I go, I forgot I asked that a few weeks ago. It's probably because I was cooking dinner and listening to a podcast.
100%. And we're in this day and age, we're constantly stimulated, right? With this podcast, music, TV, like there's always something.
Yeah. And I think, music might be a bit different, because I don't think that we need to pay. That's almost more background. So I'm just experimenting at the moment with myself with the idea of, because I've thought so much about baby brain over the years, and the maternal brain being so much attention sucked up by a baby, which is biologically important. I'm like, are babies and mobile phones almost becoming like the same degree of attention consumption? So it's just this is kind of what I'm thinking about.
It's a funny one
for myself at the moment.
And you hear all these stories like, social media, phones, like gonna like sooner or later the research is going to show that it's kind of like smoking and it's destroying our brains,
Yeah.
and our children are all fucked because
Yeah.
they're going to be on their phones and iPads at such a
Yeah.
young age. What are your thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
I'm not sure. I mean, the research is not as clear cut as um, it's been made to sound. Never is. Because, there's some upsides, there's some downsides, there's some neutrality. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in Australia, because we're almost like we're going to be the experiment for the rest of the world. There's a social media ban for under 16s, and of course that doesn't mean that they're never going to be able to access social media, but it's a bit like having a road rule. People will still speed even if there's a 50k limit, and kids will still drink under the age of 18 even though the legal drinking age is 18. It'll be an interesting experiment, and we'll be able to see what happens here in Australia with that. And maybe it will actually have a positive outcome and it will achieve what it sets out to do. I think we're still probably a bit early on to be catastrophizing, or also on the other side to say that this is going to be the answer. But I think it's certainly interesting what's going to happen.
Yeah. So like you said, we can't fast forward time, unfortunately. We have to just wait.
Yeah, we do. We have to be patient.
Yeah. We'll see what happens there. So Sarah, I'm just mindful of the time coming to the end of the show. If people want to find you on social media, hear more about your online courses, how can people catch up with you?
Yeah, so my website is Dr Sarah McKay, or Mackay, mckay.com, and so you can find out about I teach professional development training courses in applied neuroscience and brain health. I've got a similar course in women's brain health as well, that are taught online but with live kind of Q&A type experiences for people. I've been doing them for about 10 years now, so I kind of know what I'm doing, and we have a lot of fun along the way. Or give me a follow on social media. I'm on Instagram mostly and LinkedIn, and always happy to have a bit of a chat. My kind of favorite thing is explaining the brain, and I learn loads of things and read lots of stuff and try and then if I find it interesting and useful, someone else out there will as well. And so then the kind of the fun I have, I suppose, with my work is then just sharing it with people like I'm doing here. So
yeah. Well, we love to see it. I got so much out of our conversation today. Very fascinating. I can tell you're very passionate about what you do.
Yeah, I love it.
So guys, if you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend, someone who might find it useful, and go give Sarah a follow. And I appreciate you coming on. That was very enlightening.
Oh, thanks for the invitation.
Northern Beach is local, but I'll probably see you around the place.
Yeah, you will. See me down in Manly having a swim.
Love that. Thanks for coming on, Sarah.
You're welcome.